Do you remember several weeks ago, I had you all stand up and then begin to sit down? And you remember how uncomfortable that was? Let's do it again. No. This message may be just as uncomfortable, but in a different way. And I say that because we're going to hit on some things that can be hard for us to hear, hard for us to be reminded of, challenge us, but also because we'll touch on some things that I know that have affected a lot of lives in this room in one way or another. And so my prayer is this morning as we work through these challenging statements from Jesus, that as we do so, we also understand the grace that comes to us, that is available to us as we work through these things. So let's just jump right in. We begin in Matthew 5, we're in verse 27. He said, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery." It's one of the 10 Commandments. Very basic thought. Easy place to stop right there. A lot of the people that Jesus was talking to, and you'll notice he talks a lot about from the men's perspective, and that's not to exclude the women, but in Jesus' time, it was men who had all the power. And that's where a lot of the focus was. But the principles apply for us all. But he goes on to say, "I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now let's remember what he's doing. He's showing us a righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees. So a lot of them would say, you know what, I've never slept with someone that isn't my wife, so I'm good. But Jesus says, that's not good enough. Let's go to your thoughts. Let's go to your mind and what you think about doing. Then he says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. And if you get worried about that, we're going to talk about that in just a minute here. He says, it's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Now, I think as we look through these 3 sections here that we're going to look at, we can really boil them down to 3 simple, basic commands. We don't have to make this too complicated. And the first one is simply this: don't look. Don't look. I know that's easier said than done, but let's share just a few helpful ideas. One of the things that's helpful for us, because I don't know how it is with you, but as soon as somebody tells me, don't look over there, where do you want to go? You want to look over there. You go to the dentist. Now don't swallow. And you want to swallow. Whatever somebody says don't, that's the thing you want to do. So it's easy to say that, but how can we really not look? And that's because the best way to not look over there is to look over here. So let's look at a few things. First off, it's helpful if we adjust our focus range, or also known as the depth of focus. This picture will help a little bit here as we look at. And it's all about, in photography, kind of the depth of field, depth of focus, where you want to focus. You'll notice the picture on the left, the focus is on that little leaf up front. But the focus on the right is in the background. It's on the man back there. So what do you choose to focus on? Now, to get a good handle on this, we can turn to Proverbs chapter 31, which I think is often misapplied. It's often cited as a guide for women. Women, here are all the things you need to do to show that you're a good wife. But if you look at the beginning part, the very first sentence, it tells us this is actually for the man. It is a quotation of some teaching from King Lemuel's mother, what she told him. And the thought is summed up in verse 30. Charm is deceptive, and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. So all the things that she's talking about there, what she's bringing it down to is this: you can either focus on a person's outward attractiveness, or you can change your focus and you can look at the whole person. You can go deeper. And it's easy for us to get caught up in how does someone look? Do we find them attractive physically? And miss that there is a whole other aspect to the person. And so truly trying to know somebody, understand somebody, to move away from seeing a person as an object, but as to somebody who is made in the image of God and who bears within them the imago Dei, the very life and image of God. This is one of the many problems with pornography, is that it gives an unrealistic view of men and women and of sex. And it trains the brain to think about the opposite sex in this way. It teaches the brain to go in that direction. Well, now, unless we're going to dress in burqas, noticing attractiveness of other people is going to be fairly unavoidable. You're going to meet somebody walking down the street, and you might think to yourself, that's an attractive person. You see a billboard, turn on the TV, open up a magazine. You're going to see people, and you're going to make a judgment. It happens very quick. You either think that person's attractive or not. Some college friends and I, excuse me, received some great advice from a mentor, and it was this: avoid the second look. Martin Luther said it this way: you may not be able to stop a bird from landing in your hair, but you can keep them from building a nest. You can't always avoid what you're going to notice that first time, but you can control the second look, the lingering look, the coming back to time and time again. So be careful of that. Third thing we can do to help is to beware the fantasy. Now, this is just not an issue for men. While men are typically more visually oriented and stimulated, women generally are typically attracted, as somebody points out, by things that are more emotional and romantic themes in films, novels, and magazines. It's probably why the 50 Shades books were more popular as books than they were as movies. But reality can rarely compete with fantasy. And we endanger our relationships when we compare our spouses to either fictional characters or real people. In 2013, there was a story about a couple in England getting married and having their reception at a hotel. And the groom noticed that Brad Pitt was in the bar. And so he goes and gets his wife and says, "You got to come and meet Brad Pitt." Now, you see the picture here. I don't know about you. The last thing I want on my wedding night is for my wife to have had a chance to have had a side-by-side comparison of me and the sexiest man alive twice. Pitt wouldn't have stood a chance. You know, it doesn't have to be, though, just physical. We can compare how well our spouses cook, or how much money they make, or how handy they are, or may not be. But oftentimes we see only one aspect of a person. We think we know the whole person. But we really only see what they want to show us. And someone would say, "Oh, he or she's so nice, they speak so kindly," but you don't know what happens once they go inside their front door. So we need to be careful with our thought life and where we allow our thoughts to go. Some have argued or tried to argue, but no. It really is true love. Even though one of us may already be married, we've decided we're actually a better fit. And I've heard people argue, God wouldn't let me have these feelings if he didn't want us to be together, right? We need to remember we are free will beings. God does not control or cause our feelings. Our feelings come as responses to what we think about. God doesn't force feelings on us. And if you're attracted to somebody that you shouldn't be attracted to, that's not coming from God. You can probably figure out who is tempting you. Or even if we're not married yet, we think, well, it's okay because we have these feelings for one another. There are some who think that the Bible has this negative view of sex, and it does not. It has a very positive and a very beautiful view of sexual relations within its context, and its context is simply marriage. That's what God created it for, to be experienced, and that's where it's experienced best, is within marriage. And to move beyond that is to go outside of God's will, no matter how you might be feeling. But look at what Jesus goes on to say. He says, if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. So if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, your sexual ethics should be pretty clear, and Jesus' command is pretty simple. Don't look and don't touch unless you're married to each other. I'm not talking about holding hands and such, but touching in a sexual way that leads to a place that is left for marriage. Now, don't get lost in the drastic language that Jesus uses here. His words about plucking out our eyeballs and cutting off our hands are not to be taken literally. The hyperbole that he uses here lets us know that this is a serious issue with serious consequences and takes a very serious approach to handling these temptations. What it may mean is that you cut yourself off from the source of temptation. Our vice president was recently ridiculed for noting that he followed what has for many been a time-tested habit to protect his marriage and his reputation. And that was simply to not be alone with a woman who wasn't his wife. Now, some call that draconian, but if you talk to most people who've succumbed to an affair, you'll find that the seeds of that infidelity were sown while they had significant time alone together. And so you need to guard that. Protect that. People who have given into affairs and then tried to move back into the marriage and save their marriage have found that it has taken a lot. That meant maybe changing their jobs or the communities, getting away from that source of temptation. For other issues where you may be struggling, may mean getting rid of the internet, placing a serious filter on it. And it may mean reaching out and getting help. Sin loves darkness and secrets. And the first step toward change is admission of a problem. But infidelity is more than looking and more than touching. It also involves how we treat our marriage covenant. We look on what he says. It's been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. In Jesus' time, men were divorcing wives for the smallest of reasons. There was a whole school of thought that went along with that. That if she displeased you in any way, something as simple as burning the toast, as long as you gave her a certificate of divorce, you were obeying the law and you were good to go. But remember, Jesus calls us to a righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees. We spent a lot of time debating what Jesus actually meant by that last section about the adultery that can happen if you divorce a woman. What happens with her? And there are a lot of viewpoints about that, and I think sometimes the simplest is the best, and that is that sets that woman up. If you look at the context back then, a woman did not have a lot of options and choices, and she was being abandoned. But let's not miss the bigger picture here, which is what he's simply saying. Don't look, don't touch, and don't leave. Keep your commitments. Keep your vows. Now, I know there are times when we don't have a choice. A spouse is unfaithful or abusive. Paul even told us that we weren't expected to make a spouse stay who did not want to. If we look in 1 Corinthians 6, we read this: if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. What was happening is that people were married, but then one of either the wife or the husband was becoming a believer, and now they had an unbeliever. And what do you do? And he says, you can't make them stay if they don't want to stay. If the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. But we need to make sure we do not allow these extraordinary circumstances lead us back to a time and place where marriage is a temporary arrangement. What we can do, though, is work to make our marriages healthy. Now, there are a lot of resources out there to help couples with their specific situations, but let me just give you 4 general tips. Just 4 things to think about. This is not an exhaustive list. There are multitudes of books written about marriage and pre-marriage and all those things. But let me just give you a few things. First off, be wise about who you date and marry. 1 Corinthians 6:14 says this: do not be yoked together with unbelievers. Now, the issue here, sometimes we turn that into the spiritual issue, but there's a very practical reason. People who study marriages have found that some of the common factors of why some marriages succeed and others don't, why some are more joyful and others are not. And one of the things that they found is that a common factor for successful marriage is that there's a similar shared value system. We have this myth sometimes within the Christian community that you have to be a Christian in order to have a happy marriage. That's a myth. Marriage was instituted in the very, very beginning for all of creation. And I know a lot of people who are not believers who have very happy marriages, very satisfying marriages, because marriage is a part of the natural world that God created. But where we trip up is when we bring in 2 different value systems into the marriage. And so as you're preparing for marriage, think about that person and get to know them. Anybody can say, yeah, I'm a believer. Anybody can walk inside the doors of a church. One of the things that I talked to my girls about as they were going through that process of dating and such was, don't just look to see if he attends church. Does he love Jesus? Does he really want to follow Jesus? Because if you have the same common goal in your life, it will make marriage so much easier and better. Excuse me. Second, learn what it takes to be a good husband or good wife. Excuse me. Let's look at what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5. Will you mute this just for a second? Thanks. He says this, and you've got to catch this first sentence before you go into all the other verses, ladies, because this trips a lot of people up. And they go, I don't like that passage, I don't like that verse. But he says this: submit to one another. Submit to who? So who's he talking to here? Men and women. But he starts with the wives. Ladies first. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. You know, there's a number of ladies just suddenly squeeze their husband's hands real stiff. Can't believe he went there. But let's look at the other side. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. How did he do that? He died on a cross. He was scourged. He was beaten. He took the blows for the bride. And guys, if you have this lordship mentality in your home, I'm the boss, you'll do what I say, you have missed the teaching of this passage. Because those who want to be great, serve. Those who want to be first, go last. A good friend of mine told me that he didn't know for years that his father actually didn't like the dark meat on the chicken. But that's what he ate so everybody else could have the white meat. A godly husband looks to make sure his family is okay first. And that may mean denying himself some things so that they are well taken care of. He has to learn how to die to himself in this way. And notice what he says, we are members of his body. However, then he sums this up, each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. I love what one author has put together. He's written a whole book called Love and Respect. And his idea is this, that Paul focuses love to men because that's a struggle that they have, and that's what they need to be reminded of. And he focuses respect to women because that's where their struggle point may be. And we need to be reminded of the thing we want to do, or need to do, that goes against the grain for us. But here, what he's trying to tell us is this. We are a manual, a marriage manual for each other. And the best way to learn about how to have a successful marriage is to listen to your spouse. Learn from them what love looks like to them. What respect looks like to them. Not to do the thing, well, this is what I would want, so that's the thing I'll do. No, you have to listen to what communicates love, what makes deposits in your spouse's emotional bank account. But it begins first with a dying to ourselves, a commitment to do this. We need to then also understand that every relationship has its struggle points. One of the things I do in pre-marriage counseling is show all the places where marriage can struggle. Why? Because I don't want couples to be surprised when they have an issue, when something pops up, when they find themselves not at this emotional high that they were in while they were dating or engaged. But life has its ebbs and flows. And some days you look at your spouse and you go, what was I thinking? And she looks back at you and said, you were thinking, you're pretty glad you got me. But that's how relationships go. They have their struggle points. Then finally, commit to communicate. Ephesians 4:15 says, instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. Now, if this applies to the church, as we've seen back up in Ephesians, we will see in Ephesians 5, it applies to marriages as well. We need to learn how to communicate. We can solve a lot of life's problems if we just learn how to talk with one another about them. Now, in another place, when Jesus talked and he shared a lot of these same ideas, the disciples said to him, when he said, you're not supposed to get divorced, the disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry. Well, that's a cynical view, isn't it? That's how hard it was. That was how radical and revolutionary the thought was that he introduced to them. Well, we probably shouldn't even get married. And he goes on to say, well, not everyone can accept this word, but only to those whom it has been given. So receiving and accepting the biblical ethic for sexuality and marriage begins with surrendering your life as a follower of Jesus. I can tell you there have been times in our marriage when Angie and I were so frustrated with one another, we weren't sure how we could resolve the conflict. But when we turn to the Lord, When we reminded ourselves that Jesus was Lord over our individual lives, he was therefore Lord over our marriage. And we were able to find a way to seek his will. To be the one to say sorry, to start talking again, to cry some tears, to make ourselves vulnerable. We wanted to do his will, not just ours. And then we were able to find our way back to that unity that we both wanted. This morning, you may be struggling with pornography, or you've been comparing your spouse to someone else, or you've allowed someone who shouldn't be there into your heart or into your bed. Or maybe you and your spouse have grown distant, and you're wondering if it just wouldn't be easier to leave. Or maybe you've already been left. Let me encourage you, there is a way forward. And that way forward is a step toward the Lord. Whatever is happening in your life, move toward the Lord. In a moment, the worship team is going to lead us in a song of invitation and dedication. And as they come forward, let me just share you a few lines from that song. Take my will and make it thine. It shall no longer be mine. Take my heart, it is thine alone. It shall be thy royal throne. Take my love, my Lord, I pour at your feet its treasure store. Take myself, and I will ever be only all for thee. That includes this aspect of our lives. If you're ready to be different in this part of your life, the Lord is calling.
Thanks for taking time out of your day to watch this week's message. I hope it really encouraged you in your own walk with God. If you heard anything in the message and you'd like to speak with someone, or if you'd simply like to connect with someone on staff, we'd be really excited to hear from you. Please feel free to contact us at the email address or phone number below. Otherwise, thanks for watching.